go ahead and get started. I am Allison Mayberry, class of 1993, and I work in the advancement office, mostly with alumni in Texas and on the West Coast. I'd like to welcome you all to the Hill in History series, Alexander Hamilton, the Revolutionary War, and the Founding Era. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Please put your name and your class year or your parent class year. I see we have a few brand new parents here in your Zoom photo box by clicking on the three dots in the upper right-hand corner of your picture. If you need help, please ask us in the chat and we'll be happy to help you. Please mute yourself and write any questions you have throughout the evening in the chat box, and my colleague Ellen Rainey will periodically monitor the chat and will call on you to ask your question. We suggest you choose speaker view instead of gallery view so you can see our speaker instead of all of us. And now let me introduce our esteemed speaker, Christian Goodwillie.
So my name is Fran.
Oh, hi Fran, welcome.
Let me rename.
So Christian Goodwillie is Director and Curator of Special Collections at Hamilton College. He also serves as Associate Editor of the Richard W. Cooper Press. He was Curator of Collections at Hancock Shaker Village from 2001 to 2009 and was President of the Communal Studies Association. He has authored, co-authored, or edited 10 books and a number of articles on the Shakers, Freemasons, and other topics. He holds an MS in Historic Preservation from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Christian, thank you so much for joining us. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Allison. First of all, I don't know that any one of us realized it when we planned this, but it's Constitution Day. So pretty appropriate day to be looking at the founding era through objects we have in the special collections here of Burke Library here at Hamilton College. I just want to thank Advancement for asking me to do this. It's a lot of fun. And I just wanted to say up front that I'll be switching to the view with the document camera momentarily. So you'll still be able to hear me, but you're not going to see me. You're going to really be seeing the things that I'm excited to show you. I'm not wearing a mask because I'm inside by myself in a closed room. So just wanted to point that out because as one of the parents was saying in the lead up here, knock on wood, the campus has been really safe and all the students and everybody's doing a great job maintaining the conditions that facilitate us continuing to have classes. So that's why I'm not wearing a mask. Also, I'm not wearing gloves. And I want to say that up front because it is a question that I often get. Why aren't you wearing white gloves? And although that may have been standard practice in the past when handling rare books, it really no longer is. If I was handling photographs or metal objects, or if I was going to sit with a leather binding in my hand for, an hour or something, I might put on some gloves, but that's why I'm not wearing gloves. It actually inhibits your ability to feel the fineness of old paper and turn the pages without fracturing them, things like that. So without any further ado, we're going to switch over to the document camera. And let's see here. Wolf Vision. And take a look at some of the really remarkable things we have. Now, I always like to say that the special collections here at the college are something that have accrued organically really since the time of the founding, and that's because of Samuel Kirkland, our founder, was very involved in the efforts to bring about the revolution. And he was here in central New York as early as the late 1750s. And we have a number of his books in our own collection still at the library. So we're fortunate that some of these things have been on the Hill, or at least in the vicinity, 250 years nearly. This is a Benjamin Franklin imprint from Philadelphia. You can see 1746 is the date of imprint. So early enough, Franklin himself may have had a hand in perhaps setting type or pulling the press. And kind of ironically, in light of later events, it's a volume kind of celebrating Great Britain, a brief view of its history, remarkable deliverances the nation has had, and hints showing what is in the power of the several ranks of people towards securing the state from all its enemies. Well, who would know that eventually, and somewhat against his will, Franklin would be amongst the chief of those enemies. This is one of 3 Franklin imprints we have in the collection. One of the others, interestingly enough, is a catechism of the pacifist sect, the Moravians, that came out of Central Europe, and that is printed in German by Franklin. So kind of a neat overlap with our communal societies collection. Now, we all know that the bad guy in the story of the American Revolution is King George III. And a number of the documents I'll be showing you tonight, I think it's okay for me to say this, have been given to us by Robert Cady, class of 1967. He's helped us build a really remarkable set of autographed documents by some of the greats in American history. And this is a document dating to 1798, so much later than the period of the Revolutionary War, but it is the actual signature there of George Rex. So a very neat item to kick things off here. Now, we all know that there was a long period of tension leading up to the actual outbreak of war. Many different acts put forth by the British Parliament, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, Townshend Acts, declaratory acts, so many of them, which sought to put new taxes or impositions on the colonists. This was in part because Britain felt that they had paid for the defense of the colonies during the French and Indian War, and it was only right that the colonists should repay what had been expended to defend them. Of course, the colonists said no taxation without representation, and so these tensions developed. And this pamphlet here is an attempt to review the tensions and try to propose remedies for them. It's from 1769, so just right before the first real bloodshed happens. And it's by a man named Dr. Edward Bancroft. Now, some of you may be familiar with Bancroft. He was from Westfield, Massachusetts, and he did serve in the Continental Congress during the Revolution, but he ended up being a double agent. He was a secret double agent the entire time. So one of America's first spies and turncoats. He's also a medical doctor. So one of these hated taxes, the Stamp Act, was something that already existed in England. This is an issue of the London Chronicle newspaper from 1775, so a bit later than where we're at now in 1769, but it bears one of these original tax stamps on it. There were different versions of this stamp for England and for America. I'm actually showing it to you upside down here. This is the English version, but it gives you a sense of what that stamp was, and it was just proving you'd paid a tax on the paper. So this says semper eadem, which I think means always the same. Latin's not my strong point. And you can see that the amount of the tax is listed there, halfpenny. So that's one of the little things that led to armed rebellion. In 1770, March 5th, the Boston Massacre happens in Boston. Of course, I'm sure you all know the background of that, but it's the first time that British soldiers fire on an unruly mob of Americans who apparently were pelting them with ice and snowballs and things like that. But still, obviously, this poured gasoline on the fire. Now, this is a memorial oration from March of 1775, 5 years later, commemorating the Boston Massacre, 5th of March, 1770. And you'll notice it's delivered by Dr. Joseph Warren. Dr. Joseph Warren was one of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts, president of Massachusetts Revolutionary Council, and he becomes, in some ways, one of the very first martyrs of the war, which we'll get to in a second. But it's worth pointing out here, this is printed with a thick, heavy black border. This is a traditional thing called a mourning border, as in mourning. So when someone very well-known died and the newspapers reported, you would often see this kind of thing. Certainly appropriate, too, for a memorial of the Boston Massacre. Now, Alexander Hamilton, our kind of hero in waiting, was still a young man by this time living on the island of St. Croix. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the hurricane that hit the Caribbean from August 31st to September 1st of 1772. And Hamilton famously described it in a letter that he wrote to the Royal Danish American Gazette. That letter came to the attention of a man named Hugh Knox, who sponsored Hamilton to come to New York, well, first Massachusetts, then New York in October of 1772. So within 6 weeks of him writing this letter, so that he could get his education. Now, we don't have the Royal Danish American Gazette, but we do have the Gentleman's Magazine, which was almost like the Time magazine of its day. Now I'm dating myself because who even reads a print magazine anymore, right? But this was a British Imperial Clearinghouse of information. And this is the issue from November of 1772, which gives a whole series of accounts of the hurricane from different British colonial holdings, Antigua, St. Thomas, and then here we have the account from St. Croix is still more dreadful, a most violent hurricane, the like to which has never been known before. And it talks about the devastation at Christiansted, where 460 houses were thrown down. And that's where Hamilton, of course, was witnessing all of this and described it so eloquently and actually secured his future in doing so. So to move ahead to Hamilton as a young man at King's College in New York City, now, of course, Columbia. This is something which is really cool because a student discovered this. A young woman named Tracy Stafford, who is going, I think she's just starting her sophomore year, and she's on the hockey team actually too, like ice hockey. And she came and wanted to work in special collections. And we gave her a job that's pretty cool if you like old books. She's been going down the shelves, looking at every single volume, recording book plates, ownership inscriptions, presentation inscriptions, the presence of marginalia in the volumes, etc. Lo and behold, in this copy of the reports of Sir George Croke, who was a lawyer, she found the ownership inscription of Alexander Hamilton. So, and we did match it up. It is the Alexander Hamilton. So that was quite an amazing discovery. And you can see here also that on the paste down of the volume, we have a smaller thing listing Philip Hamilton. Now, I don't know if Alexander Hamilton passed this book to his beloved son, Philip, who was, of course, killed in a duel in 1802, if I remember right, which some people think caused Hamilton himself to have a death wish that led to his own duel with Aaron Burr. But we do have objects that came right from the Hamilton family. So I imagine that potentially this could have been owned by both Hamiltons.
Christian,
So,
it's
yeah.
Ellen.
Yes.
I'm curious, is there any marginalia in that book? Any, did Alexander Hamilton write any notes or do any doodles, or
That's a good
do we
question.
know if he even read it?
Yeah, I don't know. I've never looked at it. Oh, that's a good legal case, Goodwin versus Grudge. I don't know. I haven't examined it hugely closely. The student, I'm sure, would have alerted me to that because she was so excited to find this.
That's
Yeah.
so much fun that a student just came across it.
Yeah, it really is. And there's been a lot of great discoveries in the collection, which we're trying to enhance our cataloging now so that we can easily make these things discoverable for patrons. Because, of course, many efforts have been made to reconstruct the libraries of a lot of the other founders. And so I'm sure at some point it'll happen for Hamilton. So flashing forward here to 1775, we're skipping the Boston Tea Party, 1773, going right to Boston. And this is, again, the Gentleman's Magazine, volume for 1775, the January issue. Now, they published this map in the
Okay.
Oh, I think we got someone unmuted there.
Uh-huh.
Okay, great. January 1775, they printed this beautifully engraved plan of the town and chart of the harbor of Boston. Well, why do you think they might have done that, right? I mean, they knew that things were coming to a head, and so they did. April 19th of 1775, and this is the published news of that as reached the British public. You can see here description of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And so this whole volume of 1775 is filled with month-by-month news of the war as it was breaking out. In the issue for July, there's even a plan here of the fort at Charlestown or Bunker Hill battlefield. And of course, that was the first full-blown pitched battle between the Americans and the British of the war, which is often thought of as kind of a strategic victory for the Americans, although both sides bore heavy casualties. And it led to the Siege of Boston, which lasted all the way through to March of 1776, March 17, when Admiral Howe finally pulled his fleet out of Boston Harbor. One of the casualties of that battle was Dr. Joseph Warren. And although he held an officer's rank, he chose to fight as a private soldier on the battlefield, and he was killed. And so we have here eulogy that was given in his honor shortly after the battle. This is June 27th, 1775, printed in Boston. So you can't really get much closer to the time and place than something like that. Now, of course, tensions were running high all through the colonies, and the thing that really helped unite the Americans more than anything else was this pamphlet written by an Englishman named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was a bizarre character. He was given to drink a lot, but he, of course, was a writer of unbelievable power and focus, and wrote in a concise and direct style that was really ahead of its time. And so this pamphlet, which was first printed in January of 1776, went through many, many tens of thousands of printings throughout the American colonies, and of course in England as well. And Paine was so supportive of the American cause that he actually forswore all royalties on the production. And so George Washington actually had it distributed throughout the army. And this is an original printing of it from 1776 from New London, Connecticut, which printed by Timothy Green, who's a noted early Connecticut printer. Now, back in upstate New York, our own Reverend Samuel Kirkland was working with diplomacy among the Native Americans here. And he was trying his best to secure the Six Nations participation in this armed conflict on the side of the Americans. And this is an original letter from our Samuel Kirkland papers written at Oneida, New York, so a little west of here. This is today's Oneida Castle, April the 8th of 1776. It's written to Timothy Dwight, who's in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Timothy Edwards in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, the son of the famous minister Jonathan Edwards of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon. And he writes, "Honored Sir, the bearer sets out much sooner than expected. My house has been thronged almost night and day for weeks past. The council has broke up at Onondaga, the result of which I think shows the fickleness and instability of Indians. Mr. Butler," now this is the loyalist leader, John Butler, "gains an influence with the Seneca and other remote tribes. He is to kindle up a council fire at Niagara 1.5 months from now. The Western nations are generally expected. He has told the Indians that his counsel shall be of peace. However, he's warned them of the approaching danger that Virginia will come from the southward and New England from the east and take him at Niagara and open the reduction of that place. And upon the reduction of that place, they will immediately fall upon the Six Nations and exterminate them from the earth." So this is Samuel Kirkland's right in the middle of this this negotiation. As we know, he succeeds in gaining the Oneidas and Tuscaroras to the American cause, but the other four of the Six Nations do side with the British. Now, one thing I'd like to bring attention to now is when I came to Hamilton, I was amazed at the history around here and of course the Kirkland papers, and found that we had many documents in Iroquois languages that had never been translated. Here's one example. This is from 1776. And I thought it was a shame, given the heritage of the college, the original educational mission to educate indigenous youth as well as settler youth, that we had these documents, but no one knew what they said. So I reached out to a couple scholars, Cliff Abbott at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and then Karam Tiro, who's at Xavier University in Cincinnati. And we had them translate all of the Iroquois language documents in our collection. So we have here a transcription, transliteration, and then translation. And this is because Oneida is spoken by very, very few people, and Cliff Abbott is one of the only guys that can do something like this. And so we're hoping that this book will also help perpetuate the Oneida language to some degree, and there's some Mohawk documents in here as well. This is one of our Cooper Press books, and you can buy it from our website. And I saw the question in the chat. I came to Hamilton in 2009. So 1776 in Philadelphia, of course, that summer, we have the Continental Congress meeting and ultimately the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And this pamphlet here is an oration given by Samuel Adams in August the 1st of 1776. It's an English printing of it, interestingly, from the same year. There was a fair amount of the English public was sympathetic to the American cause, and some major English politicians were as well. But I find it fascinating to see that this pamphlet was printed so soon after the speech was given, with this nice engraved portrait of Samuel Adams. And I hope some of you are enjoying a Sam Adams right now. I can't because I have to be around the rare books, but hopefully later. So going back to the Gentleman's Magazine, this is the volume for August of 1776, and opposite an article called Qualifications of a Siberian Hairdresser, we find the first English printing of the Declaration of Independence. So, declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled July 4th. We all know it when in the course of human events. So, very cool to be able to show this to students that we've got this in our collection. Now, the war theater shifts to New York City and Long Island. There's a battle on Long Island. Washington retreats strategically to Manhattan and then north across Manhattan. Bear with me as I unfold this map without ripping it. And ultimately, a final battle of that season at White Plains. Washington's success really is that he's kept the Continental Army going through a series of retreats. But here's the map from the Gentleman's Magazine of the theater of war. It's called Map of the Progress of His Majesty's Armies in New York during the late campaign. And so you can see Brooklyn provincials defeated August 27th. Provincials drowned here at Red Hook. You can see southern Manhattan there, Wall Street, and then up at Harlem where there was another battle, and then Fort Washington right at the northern tip of Manhattan where there was a battle before Washington withdrew to White Plains, and ultimately the army was brought over into New Jersey for the winter. So incredible that these maps remain with the books. A lot of times in libraries, that's unfortunately not the case. In upstate New York, meanwhile, the war had become truly a civil war. Sir William Johnson, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British Crown, had died in 1774, and his home at Johnson Hall had been the center of many negotiations with the Iroquois Samuel Kirkland certainly visited there numerous times. And his son, Sir John Johnson, left to Canada in May of 1776. And so they waged then war back from Canada on the Mohawk Valley. And there was a series of campaigns all the way as late as 1781 in what was called Tryon County at that point. But this is an engraving of the siege of, they call it Fort Schuyler here. We know it as Fort Stanwix. This is, of course, what followed the Battle of Oriskany that happened on August 6th of 1777. So this was one of the bloodiest areas of conflict, and lots of massacres perpetrated by both sides in that war. Captain Joseph Brant, who had been a schoolmate of Samuel Kirkland and a friend of his, suddenly found himself facing Kirkland's allies in battle. And of course, Brant reason he is defending his homeland, certainly as much as any of the Anglo-European settlers, the Whigs, the Patriots, were trying to take that for themselves. So this is a great early work of upstate New York history, the Annals of Tryon County. Now, in October,
Kristen?
yeah.
Hi, it's Ellen again.
Yes.
While we're looking at this beautiful white screen, Stephen Clark, class of 81, has a question.
Yeah, sure.
He asks, and you know this is near and dear to my heart, have these wonderful materials been digitized? Are they available to students doing relative research? Are they in stable enough condition to be loaned, or do they remain in Clinton?
Yeah, a lot of these could be loaned to like an exhibition. I don't think we would loan them like interlibrary loan. I mean, we wouldn't loan them as interlibrary loan. Many of the materials I'm showing you have been digitized, just not by us. The manuscripts that are unique, we have digitized, but a lot of these books exist in digital form in databases that we subscribe to, or else even public ones like Google Books, things like that. But certainly students, everything I'm showing you, there's nothing we have in special collections that students cannot use or access. I mean, it's here for them, period. You know, and we try to be as open and accommodating as possible with that, even to having evening hours and things to facilitate them using the collections, because they may have sports right after their classes, you know. But if there was things that weren't available elsewhere, we certainly would digitize them for student use. Absolutely. So 1777, of course, the major event that year is the defeat of General Burgoyne at the Battle of Saratoga. And this really neat map shows the whole progress of Burgoyne's army coming south from Canada through Lakes Champlain and George, and then down to the battle areas at Hoosick Falls and Saratoga, just north of Albany. Now, George Washington's army, of course, went into winter quarters that year. Because Horatio Gates had been the hero of that battle, there was a lot of people trying to engineer Washington's replacement by Horatio Gates. But it did not come to pass. And in that winter at Valley Forge from 1777 to 1778, there was the pleasant surprise of the arrival of the Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military man who wasn't really a baron apparently, but he liked to play one in international affairs. No one questioned his credentials. What they did see when he arrived in February of 1778 was that he was a very good drill master, and he brought the Continental Army into order in a way that had never been before. And he actually wrote a manual, Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States. This went through a number of printings. We have 5 or 6 different printings of it, but I'm showing you this one because it has this wonderful fold-out plate at the front that shows exactly how the troops are supposed to line up and which companies go where and where the majors go and the adjutants and so forth. So pretty cool little book. What's really interesting about von Steuben, we have a number of his letters, and he apparently had to leave Europe because he may have been involved in some kind of pederasty or something in the Prussian court. And when he was in the colonies, he became very, very close with two fellow soldiers, William North and Benjamin Walker. And this is a letter from Steuben to William North, and it's dispatched by Walker. And he says, let's see here, make haste, my dear friend, to join me as soon as possible. Colonel Walker goes with me to camp. So these two men were actually legally adopted by von Steuben, and he settled in this vicinity after after the war was over. He was given a bunch of land, and they actually came up and lived with him. So there's been big historical question about the actual nature of the relationship of these men, and the question probably will never be answered, but it's kind of an interesting social history kind of subtext to that period. Now, 1778 also saw the crucial negotiations that led to the Treaty of the French in allying with the colonies. So this is a printing of that Treaty of Alliance, eventual and defensive, between His Most Christian Majesty Louis the 16th, by the grace of God, and the 13 United States of America. So this almanac, which is actually an almanac from 1783, but it's printing that important treaty of 1778. Now, in Paris, we had Benjamin Franklin and John Adams negotiating that treaty. And again, from the Robert Cady collection, we have this small note in John Adams' hand where he says, Mr. Adams conveys to Mr. Genet all the papers he has received by the last vessels, July 9th, 78. So this is almost certainly the man that Edouard Genet, who became Citizen Genet, who was the emissary of the revolutionary French government to the United States in 1791 and caused, got another mute thing going on, caused a lot of problems for George Washington because he was trying to encourage American sailors to basically go on privateering missions against the British on behalf of the French. Now, of course, the Americans at that point just want to get the country going. They don't want to get involved in another war. But this shows you, too, the importance of the newspapers. This was, by this time, things could happen. And within a month, even in Europe, you would be able to know what happened. 1779 saw the Sullivan expedition. Because of what had gone on in upstate New York with Native Americans led by Joseph Grant and John Butler and his son Walter, and also Sir John Johnson, the Washington, well, it wasn't the administration yet, the Continental Army decided that they were going to invade central and western New York and lay waste to all the native towns that they could find. They cut down all the orchards, burned the crops in the field. They basically wanted to create a famine for the Native Americans that winter. So this is a history of the Sullivan Campaign from the centennial of it, which is 1879, with a number of maps. This map here shows the largest battle that happened, which was at Newtown during that campaign. So the climactic event of the war, of course, is the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. And again, from the Gentleman's Magazine, we have General Washington's letter to the President of Congress on the surrender of the British Army under Lord Cornwallis. It is truly characteristic. The whole substance is comprised in the few words that follow. I have the honor to inform Congress that the reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected. So we know this was the battle where Alexander Hamilton lobbied Washington for a final chance at getting some actual glory on the battlefield, something Washington really did not want to let him do. But nonetheless, he let him do it, and Hamilton led a charge on a redoubt just outside the British lines, and they succeeded in taking it, and Hamilton was unharmed, and so he got his glory. And then ultimately, of course, they all got their glory with the surrender of Cornwallis. So as the war wound down, another object from the Cady collection is a very neat relic of that time. This is a discharge to a man named Samuel Collins by His Excellency George Washington, Esquire, General and Commander-in-Chief of the Forces of the United States of America. This is to certify that Samuel Collins, Sergeant, who had served from April of 1777, has now been basically paroled to go home from the Army. And it's actually signed by George Washington, dated June 7th, 1783. So that's our only Washington document in the collection here at the college. So as the war was finished, the process of figuring out how to move ahead for this society and forming a new government was begun. And Alexander Hamilton was right there in the middle of it. This is a manuscript page. Forgive the glare here. I hate to remove this from its mylar because it's very fragile. But this is a manuscript page from the legal case, Rutgers versus Waddington. So Hamilton was involved in this case. I'm just going to read you the synopsis of it here. New Yorker Elizabeth Rutgers, a well-to-do elderly widow who fled the British Army in 1776, sued Joshua Waddington for 8,000 pounds in damages caused by Waddington's use of her brewery during the British occupation. Rutgers brought her action under the terms of the Trespass Act. Serving as counsel to the defense, Hamilton shredded the law as essentially illegal and won a tenfold reduction in the damage claim. Rutgers versus Waddington did not establish the principle that courts could strike down a law as unconstitutional, but it planted the seeds that later grew into that check or block against abuse of legislative power. So it was an important case, and this is the brief from the case in Hamilton's own hand. When I first came to the college, I don't want to say skeptical, but I wanted to really verify that this was a manuscript in Hamilton's hand because, you know, there are many copies oftentimes of legal documents. So I sent scans of it to the editors of the Hamilton papers, and they said, yep, that's the real thing. So it's great to find out. This has been fully digitized and is available on our website in the digital collections. So 3 years later, after the kind of unsuccessful effort to administer the new United States under the Articles of Confederation, in 1787, the delegates met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, which was held in strict secrecy because they weren't authorized to write a new constitution. They were just supposed to possibly figure out how to improve the Articles of Confederation. Hamilton, of course, was there, and this is a printing of the Constitution from 1787, one of the very first American printings from Matthew Carey's American Museum magazine of Philadelphia. Carey was an Irish immigrant who got the patronage of both George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, and was a very successful and important printer all the way up until about 1820. But this is in a beautiful original binding. It's really a treasure. And it also contains, a little later on, the Federalist Essays. So here we have the Federalist, Letter 1, by our very own Alexander Hamilton. And notice it's written to the people of the state of New York. And I've got to thank my friend, Professor Doug Ambrose. I heard an excellent lecture from him about the Federalist Papers, where he really hammered home the point that the Federalist Essays were only an effort, for the most part, to convince people in New York to vote to ratify the Constitution. They weren't widely known or cited by legal scholars until really very late in the 19th and mostly in the 20th century. So we look at them as being way more important today than they necessarily were at the time. But getting New York to join the Constitution was, of course, hugely important. So cool to have that first printing of it. Next, I'll show you an artifact that demonstrates that people can come back together even after horrible conflict. And I showed this in my other talk I did on our special collections, but this is the Book of Common Prayer translated into Mohawk. And it was done by Captain Joseph Brant, the Mohawk War Chief, printed in London that same year, 1787. what's so neat about this copy is it's a presentation copy from a present from Captain Joseph Brant to the Reverend Mr. Samuel Kirkland, Niagara, 15th July, 1788. So despite the fact that Brant by that time had relocated to Canada and had lost his homeland, he still thought enough of Kirkland to send him this book. So I think it's a really touching artifact. Now, Hamilton's life kind of started to take a bad turn. In the early 1790s, he was appointed as the Secretary of the Treasury by George Washington in his first administration, published his very important report on the public credit, which urged the federal government to assume the debts of the states and so kind of unite them in debt, which of course they were supposed to pay back, and then also establish a national bank. And this is the Pennsylvania Packet and Daily Advertiser newspaper from December 22nd, 1790, which has original printing here of this report on the public credit by Hamilton. Some people malign Hamilton, to this day because he essentially helped us found our country on debt. But I'm not an economist. I can't really say either way. So Hamilton came under a lot of fire because as within Washington's cabinet, which only slowly became apparent to Washington, there were two factions forming, Jeffersonians, who became the Democratic Republicans, and then the Federalists, led by Hamilton. Now, Jefferson hired writers to write against Hamilton and kind of do opposition research on him. And there was a Scottish writer named James Thomson Callender, who was an alcoholic and really kind of a muckraker before his time, who published an expose of Hamilton's affair with a woman named Maria Reynolds. Hamilton, of course, was married to the daughter of General Philip Schuyler, and Elizabeth Hamilton, she was, a very upright woman, and it was pretty tawdry that Hamilton had the affair with Maria Reynolds. Well, Callender also accused Hamilton of financial misdeeds, financial speculation when he was Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton reacted by publishing this pamphlet, and this is the original printing of it, where he refuted the charge of speculation, but he also published verbatim all of his love letters with Maria Reynolds, with whom he'd had the affair. His family was horrified, and the story is that they attempted to destroy as many copies of this pamphlet as they could so that it wouldn't circulate. But this copy actually was given to the college by Hamilton's grandson, Allen McLean Hamilton, in 1918. So we're fortunate to have a copy of the famous Reynolds pamphlet. Opposition editors, such as Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, in his newspaper, the Aurora General Advertiser, really took Washington and Hamilton to task. They accused Washington of cowardice and all of the Federalists of just unending horrible deeds. And it started an era of political discord that I would argue is almost as bad as what we're experiencing right now. Hamilton founded his own newspaper, securing the services of William Coleman as his editor. Coleman was a Federalist from Greenfield, Massachusetts. He'd been involved in a duel earlier in his life, and he edited the New York Herald for Hamilton. Well, this issue, September 11th of all dates of the New York Herald, is, I believe, the first or maybe the second printed mention of Thomas Jefferson's alleged affair with Sally Hemings. And let's see here. Here it is. From the Recorder, that's the Richmond Recorder. It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor, Jefferson's president, of course now, keeps and for many years has kept as his concubine one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally. The name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said to bear a striking, although sable, resemblance to those of the president himself. So this was about as low as you could get in early American politics. And given that it was published in Hamilton's own paper, there were sure to be repercussions. Now, Jefferson, of course, had won the contested election of 1800, with Aaron Burr as his vice president, Hamilton had unbelievably attacked John Adams with a pamphlet, really damaging Adams' run and also angering the rest of the Federalists. Now, Callender, the Scottish alcoholic anti-Federalist writer, approached Jefferson after Jefferson's election and asked to be made the postmaster of Richmond, Virginia, as kind of a little thank you. Jefferson declined, and so Callender then turned on Jefferson. And so this newspaper, which is called the Balance and Columbian Repository, was a Federalist newspaper out of Hudson, New York, edited by a man named Harry Croswell. Croswell delighted in publishing things that would embarrass Democrats. So he's embarrassing Jefferson, noting Callender's turning on him. And then the next year, momentously, he publishes this item where he's talking about Black Sally. And again, that's Sally Hemings. Now, Jefferson decided to go after Croswell in the state of New York for libel. Hamilton defended Croswell, and Hamilton made the point that truth could be a defense in a libel case. So he's essentially saying, you know, Thomas Jefferson, you may not like this, but it's the truth, and therefore it's not a libel. And that precedent was then established that truth could be a defense in a libel case. That was the last great public event of Hamilton's career, legal or political, of course, except for the final act of his duel with Aaron Burr. This is the Boston Repertory of July 24th, 1804, of course, after the duel. But we have here all of the letters that passed back and forth between Hamilton and Burr leading up to the fateful day. And these were printed in newspapers all over the country. People, it was, you know, like watching a car crash in slow motion. They couldn't get enough of this major tragedy that had unfolded. You know, the vice president assassinating the former secretary of the Treasury. Although I guess Burr was not anymore, I think, the vice president at that time, but he had been in the first Jefferson term. So, of course, Hamilton is killed, and here is the issue of the New York Herald paper. Again, Hamilton's own pet paper, edited by William Coleman. We talked about those mourning borders. Well, here we see, this is the printing in Hamilton's own newspaper of his funeral. And we have here the funeral procession and the order of the marchers, and it's mentioning eulogists and so forth. And William Coleman, who remained loyal to Hamilton, of course, after his death, published this book, 1804, collection of the facts and documents relative to his death with all of the orations, sermons, and eulogies. Now, Robert Cady just gave to the collection this past Saturday a really neat piece of ephemera. This is a printed certificate for shares in the estate of Alexander Hamilton. And you can see here November of 1804, so we're now 5 months after the duel. And this one's presented to Morgan Lewis, and it's signed by Hamilton's trustees, Gouverneur Morris, Rufus King, Oliver Wolcott Jr., Charles Wilkes. I'm not sure who that Benson is, the third guy. Gouverneur Morris, of course, is a famous character in his own right. He was known as kind of a rake, a ladies' man. He was lost part of his leg in a carriage accident in 1780 and was the American representative in France during the Reign of Terror. And his diaries from that time are an incredible source for that history. So Hamilton, of course, died then in 1804. I just have a couple other things to show you here. The first collection of his written works, which is in 3 volumes, printed in 1810, so only 6 years after his death. And then incredibly, which I always enjoy telling people about this, his much larger works printed in 1840. And these copies were in the stacks. You could check them out as recently as 2010, but amazingly, they were the family copies, and they bear the signatures. Here's the signature of Eliza Hamilton Holly, Hamilton's 7th child, his second daughter. And then some of the other volumes actually have the signature of Elizabeth Hamilton herself. So, and you can see they've been well loved in the stacks. I'll just close with a couple objects from the Katie collection. We have a signed letter of Lafayette, 1829. You see it's written in French. And then a Thomas Jefferson letter of 1825. And this letter, you can see it's dateline Monticello, November 16th, 1825. This actually pertains to the founding of what was to be called the College of Columbia Medical School in Washington, D.C. Today, that institution is George Washington University. And then finally, I love this one because we all know Adams and Jefferson had a really bitter falling out, then famously repaired their relationship and began this really epochal correspondence that's so important to our understanding of the founding. This is Adams writing not to Jefferson, but he's jokingly datelining his letter Montezillo instead of Monticello. So he's just kind of having a little fun at Jefferson's expense behind his back. But they were friends by this time, so I guess it was okay. I'll just close with a plug for this book, which I hope people know about through our own Hamilton news, but this is Professor Doug Ambrose's book, Your Obedient Servant, The Letters of Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, and it goes along with the wonderful exhibit at the Fenimore Museum in Cooperstown, which is still up. And we have all the letters here in photographic facsimile as well as transcriptions. And Doug's written a great essay introducing and explaining all of it. So I would encourage everyone to find this book. That concludes my presentation. And I'll go back now to the camera where you can see me. And I'm happy to take any questions. But if people want to go, that's fine too. So whatever you want.
We do have a few questions in the chat, Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we do. And the first one, you know, you were saying, and it's terrific that our students and our faculty have access to the special collections. Emily asked, can alumni get access to the special collections? Perhaps not during COVID, but at other
Yeah,
times.
absolutely. I mean, we deal with outside researchers all the time. I don't know if it's good to say this or not, but anybody can come have access to the special collections. Obviously, if someone looks like they don't have the best intentions, we would be careful. But yeah, no, it's a publicly available collection. Yeah, unfortunately, I think the college policy right now is unless you're a student, faculty, or staff member, they don't want anyone on the Hill. But when we hopefully get back to normal soon, then by all means, yes.
Terrific. Yeah. Unless you're being tested in our testing center, you can't go in our buildings right now. So another question that actually I think Archivist Emerita, Kathy, has answered, but are there any papers from Elizabeth Hamilton, and did she ever come to Hamilton College? Do you know?
I do not believe we have any.
Archives have something.
Oh, go ahead.
She says the archives has a note.
A note, okay. I was unaware of that. And I don't believe she ever came to the college, but I don't know. I mean, she lived until, 1849 or something? So who knows? But yeah, I was not aware of that note, so I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
It's on the Burke Facebook page. It's just a note from Elizabeth to Mrs. Rensselaer asking to have a pot copied for Mrs. Washington.
Oh.
I put the link in the chat if you can, anybody who has Facebook can go to it.
Thank you, Kathy. I hope you're enjoying your retirement.
Very much.
Good.
Ernie asks if Ron Chernow did any research at Hamilton for his biography.
If Kathy is still on, I'll defer to her because that was before my time.
I do not recall, and it probably would have been through Frank Lorenz. I think it was actually, I think he did the research before my time too. So it would be Frank Lorenz that he would have talked to and worked with.
Yeah, and he might have, I don't remember either. Stephen has another good question. When he was at Hamilton, Lee Keno of Stephen, why don't you ask the question? Lee Keno was Antiques Roadshow, right? Can I unmute you? Can you unmute yourself? Well, if you can't unmute
Yes, he was.
There,
He did.
okay. So do you want to ask your question about what Lee Keno did? Lee?
Yeah, so when Lee was a couple of years ahead of me at Hamilton, but I remember when he was there, he spent an enormous amount of time rummaging around in attics and basements and barns to find antique furniture and paintings and drawings and cataloged them all. And a lot of it was unknown, you know, it had just been stuck away somewhere and nobody really knew it was there. And so my question is, has the college always known somehow that the material that you're describing, the special collections material, exists? Was it always sort of cataloged and present, or was it found in various attics and bookshelves and gathered together at some point?
Well, with campus of our longevity and history, we certainly are still finding things. In some cases, just rediscovering them, like these Hamilton books that were in the stacks. So there were areas like in the James Library, which is now Christian Johnson Hall, the treasure room in that library, and we'd find items that have that stamp on them still. So there was certainly by the early 20th century a recognition that some of these things deserved an extra level of protection or management. To be very honest, when I came here in 2009, there was still incredible stuff out in the stacks, and we actually systematically went through the stacks and took a lot of things and put them in special collections where they really belonged. The situation, and I'm going to speak honestly, openly here to all of you because you're here because you love Hamilton, the situation with the college's material collections that don't belong in a museum like Welland, which is so focused on living contemporary artists, there's not a good home for those still. There's not a good management system in place. It's something I've called out for in 10 years that I've been here. It's a space issue. Where do we put these things? Also, you know, it's not fashionable to have a lot of portraits of our 19th century prominent people on the walls at this point. What do we do with them now? How do we contextualize them? Where should they go? And I'd love to have a spot on campus where those things could be properly cared for and at least managed, because they are part of our history.
Andres Enriquez had a question about Sally. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for this terrific presentation. It's super interesting. I was just wondering whether the Sally Hemings, I know you said it was noted way back then, whether it was well-known rumors, pretty well-known, was it just gossip, and why did the Jefferson Society take so long to admit that Sally Hemings existed? Can you give some context to that?
I can try. I mean, it certainly, I think, was very widely disseminated in the press, of course, led by Jefferson's enemies. And then, I've read the wonderful book, The Hemingses of Monticello by Annette Gordon Reed. It's been a little while now since I've read that, but I think that even as early as the 1850s, people had interviewed some of the descendants of people that were purportedly the product of that relationship of Jefferson and Hemings. Why it took Monticello so long to acknowledge that? I mean, I certainly couldn't speak for them about that, but I will say that I know they're really doing some incredible ongoing architectural investigation in some of the rooms that are in kind of the level of Monticello that's underneath the main house, kind of like where wine cellars and different food preparation areas would be. And they think they found a room that they want to say could have been where Sally Hemings lodged. I think the evidence for that's pretty rudimentary at this point, but it's something they're trying to grapple with head on and interpret as best they can. But I certainly couldn't speak for them.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Just a couple more questions. One from Bob Katie's classmate. Do you know how Bob got interested in this and started collecting these signatures and I guess thankfully giving them to Hamilton?
Is Bob on, by the way? Because it'd be great if he isn't. Oh, that's too bad. I did tell him that I was going to be, maybe he got embarrassed and didn't want to.
Let me, I think I see him here. I'll see if I can unmute, ask him to unmute.
Do you? Where is he?
Bob, are you there?
There he is.
Maybe he doesn't hear.
I see his name, but I don't hear.
Well, if he comes on, I'll certainly defer to him, but I don't know the exact answer to that question. I do know that starting maybe 4 years ago, he would start coming up to special collections extremely enthusiastically, showing us these things that he had collected. And it kind of slowly turned into, and I would like them to be here at Hamilton College so that the students at Hamilton can use them. And so it's been a wonderful thing. It's kind of like twice a year he comes and brings his latest treasures, and he is so excited. I mean, you can tell he has such a deep love of history. He's so excited when he shows my coworker Mark and myself the new things he's gotten, and he stands and reads them to us, and we kind of like sit and it's like, wow, that's awesome. Thomas Jefferson letter, thank you. Okay, what's next? So we're very grateful for his benefaction to the college of these wonderful primary source materials, and that's the key thing. This is the real thing. This is a letter in the hand of, written by this person, and it's not just the founding fathers. It's Frederick Douglass, it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it's Susan B. Anthony, it's Martin Luther King Jr., Richard Nixon. He's got a very broad kind of collecting appetite for American history.
Thank you, Bob, if you're there. I think probably final question from Emily Hull. Emily, are you still on?
Yep.
You are? Yeah.
Yep.
You had a two-part question. Go for it.
Yeah, so it was 2 parts disconnected, but yeah. So my first question was, you showed us some stuff from gentlemen's magazines, and I wanted to know what exactly that gentlemen's magazine is and who would have had access to them. That's the first question.
Sure. Well, the Gentleman's Magazine was published out of London. It was a monthly magazine starting in, I think, 1735 or thereabouts. It was probably something that the upper classes would have subscribed to, but there were a lot of different magazines at that time in the British Empire. There was the Town and Country magazine, the Westminster magazine. In Scotland, they had the Scots magazine. There was the Royal magazine, and they were all kind of copying each other's content, so you find a lot of overlapping content, but they're incredible sources because they're in keeping with the Enlightenment period in which they were published. There's all kinds of great natural history stuff, just age of discovery, certainly the age of empire and all the military engagements, and then lots of literature, poetry, music. So it's really a cultural clearinghouse, and there's such a joy to sit down and read. And of course, we have them all fully electronically. So if you have alumni access, you can access them all. But if you come here, you can sit down with them as well. And they're not that expensive. If you go on eBay, look for Gentleman's Magazine, be a little careful with the results, of course. But if you restrict yourself to antiquarian and books, you can get volumes of the Gentleman's Magazine pretty reasonably. Now, if it's the 1776 volume, it's going to be a few $1,000s. But even ones from the 1760s and early 70s, especially if someone's cut out the illustrations, which is terrible, but it's very common, you can get those for $50. So,
If only I wasn't 24 working somewhat. minimum wage job. And my second question, which was unrelated, was you showed us a Lafayette letter. I was wondering if anybody had translated that.
Yeah, I believe it is translated in the folder. Let me grab it here. And actually, most of the Baron von Steuben letters, a lot of them are in French, and they have been translated as well. Let's see. Lafayette letter. Yes, it is translated right here. He is talking. It's from an American. It's responding to an American woman received her patriotic letter. As you know, Americans enjoy wonderful country, blah blah blah. So I don't know. It's not a certain hugely important letter, but
right, just very flowery. But
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The other reason I asked is because I know Cornell has a number of the Lafayette letters between like him and his wife, and a number of them haven't been translated. Like you can see kind of scanned versions, but they're like, we currently don't really have English translations for a lot of these. So
Wow, that's amazing that there's some untranslated still.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a great collection. I know that collection, and Lafayette's story, especially his tour of the United States in 1825, is such a neat thing. I mean, the fact that 50 years later he can come and every town throws a giant celebration when he comes. And the house I live in Clinton was the house of Major Barnabas Pond, who was in the Revolutionary Army. And he's supposed to have been friends with Lafayette from Valley Forge. They were both there that winter. That's documented. And when Lafayette came to Utica, he supposedly saw Barnabas Pond in the crowd, and they embraced and were crying and stuff.
Aww.
I can only date that story to the 1870s, so I'm a little skeptical, but I want it to be true, of course.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate your.
Oh, thank you.
And
Yeah.
I appreciate this whole thing. This was really cool.
Yeah. Did we meet when you were here? Or?
I don't think we did. I was so I graduated with a bachelor's in psychology and archaeology, so like tangentially related, but like I'm from this area, so
cool.
So local history has always kind of been an interest to me as well.
Come by when we're open again, and be glad to show you any of these things.
I'd love to see them.
Great.
Well, we want to thank everybody for coming. That was absolutely fascinating. So thanks so much to Christian for that presentation. Thank you to all of our generous donors who have made gifts in support of Hamilton students. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't suggest that gifts can always be made on our website. So thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and we hope we'll see you at a future Hamilton College virtual event.
Thank you.
Good night.